Out of the thousands of videos there are trying to figure out how normal people can end up becoming serial killers, I feel like I haven't really seen anyone discuss what I'm about to discuss today, which is really strange, especially because the mechanism that I'm going to discuss we all have inside of us, and if not functioning correctly, can lead to very deviant behaviors, like offing people. So, hi everybody, for those that don't know me, my name is Sabrina. I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel, we talk about psychology as we see it in various Netflix series and films. And today I'll be talking about the series Dexter, one of my absolute favorite series ever. And I found out in the very last video that I did that apparently this is not on Netflix anymore. But you know what? Netflix is not paying me. So I can truly do what I want on this channel. And also, I feel like it had its longest tenure on Netflix. That's where I first saw it. So to me, it counts. So today we're going to be getting a little weird and we're going to be diving into Freudian theory. That's right. I'll be talking to you about theory from the cocaine cowboy himself, Mr. Sigmund Freud. But first, I have a question for you. Have you ever felt torn between doing what you know you should do, what you want to do, and then what's actually realistic to do? It's that inner battle that kind of rages inside of all of us. Well, Freud has a model of our mind slash our psyche that he divides into three elements, three components of human personality. That is known as the id, the ego, and the superego. While three separate entities, while three separate distinct categories, all three of them work together to really influence our behaviors, our emotions, and just kind of our characteristics as people. According to Freud, understanding these three components, was key to understanding human psychology. And honestly, I don't think he was all that wrong. Now, this is not an unfamiliar topic for anybody who's taken like a Psych 101 class, but it is in terms of applying it to someone like Dexter. So for people who haven't watched the show, because on my channel you don't need to watch any of the shows that I talk about, I'll give a brief recap of Dexter. So early on in his life, Dexter's mother was unfortunately brutally offed right in front of his eyes. And a police officer at the time, when he came and saw the scene and saw Dexter there as a young child, decided to adopt him, decided to take him home because he felt that he wasn't too far gone yet. He did figure out pretty quickly, early on when Dexter was a boy, that he was incorrect about this when Dexter started doing the classic signs of offing or torturing other animals in the neighborhood. And he came to realize that Dexter was not like everybody else, that he had these dark urges that needed to be controlled. So he decided to create a code for Dexter, a code where he will only hurt bad people, people that were deserving of it, that the law couldn't catch legally, that Dexter could then off himself. As Dexter grows older, he calls these urges his dark passenger, and this dark passenger being this desire to harm people and needing to keep it under control, needing to make sure it stays in line with the code of Harry. Now, if you're interested in seeing whether somebody like Dexter could actually keep this kind of code, feel free to watch the other video that I just did on that. But for now, we're just going to jump into these three components that I talked about. And as a reminder, no one thing can account for all of who we are. Like, if you are a true crime girly, by now you know that a lot of the really famous serial killers out there had suffered like a severe blow to the head. I talk about this in the video that I do on sociopaths, for example. And they also, a lot of them suffered some kind of severe childhood trauma, just like Dexter. So, what I'm talking about today is just one more thing to add to the puzzle of figuring out how a person can really do some horrible things. So, to start with the id is the most primitive part of our brain, and it's the only one of the three that I'll talk about today that's present with us from birth. The id is all about our basic drives and instincts, the most common being the drives for sex and aggression. But it's also behind other drives, things like our hunger, our thirst, etc. Because this is the most primitive part of our brain, it's all about immediate gratification. I want it, and so I'm gonna get it. Just like Ariana Grande said in Seven Rings, right? I want it, I got it. That's the hit. So it operates on the pleasure principle, where it's trying to gratify our wants and our desires despite reality, despite logic, and despite social norms. So the id is incredibly impulsive, irrational, and amoral. Thinking of Dexter, this is simply what he's labeling his dark passenger. Remember when I told you one of the most basic drives of the id is that of aggression? Well, Dexter wanting to drive a knife through someone's chest is pretty aggressive. The thing is, as opposed to serial killers, our strongest and most consistent drives from the id may not be as much in the aggressive realm like theirs are. But whether it's a baby crying for milk, an adult fantasizing about getting revenge on somebody who wronged them, or you staying home from work to binge season 3 of Squid Game, we were all operating in the pleasure principle in these moments. And remember, our brain is a learning machine. So the more that we do something and we get pleasure from it, the more our brain is going to push us to want to do that specific thing again. So the more that Dexter and other serial would off people, the more the brain is going to push them to do that again and again and again to satisfy that aggressive impulse because it gave them some kind of relief when they did it. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, all right, well, we're not all just wild animals that have to satisfy our urges in that moment. And even with a lot of prolific serial killers in history, they had moments where they didn't act on their impulse. And especially with Dexter and this code of Harry, it took a pretty significant vetting process, as he called it, to actually determine when he would harm people. So sometimes he'd have to wait a while before he got somebody on his table and was able to, do what he did best. So, what controls the id? Well, before we talk about that, we're going to swing all the way over to the other side and talk about the superego. So the superego is the moral aspect of our personality. So this operates on the morality principle. So the superego internalizes societal values and rules as well as the things that our parents or guardians teach us are right from wrong. So because it's something that we have to be taught, it doesn't emerge until the first few years of life, until around age 5 or so. The thing is, this aspect of our personality is just as unrealistic as the id because it's striving for perfection. If we fail at doing something, it's like that inner critic that's always getting down on us for not doing something correctly and getting down on us for doing something and knowing that we should have been better at this thing. So, if for instance you lie, but you get away with it, nobody realizes that you lie, and you still feel guilty, that's the superego at work. Because in a lot of societies that those watching this live in, or maybe from your parents, you were taught that lying is bad. And so if you do this, even if people don't catch you, then you feel that weight of having done something bad. Your superego is saying you failed at this thing. And I'll talk about in a minute why some people don't seem to have the super ego to where they can just do things like lying and just truly not care. Thinking of Dexter, his super ego is the code of Harry that he internalized. I mean, Dexter even said it himself that he doesn't care about societal rules, which tracks because he definitely has antisocial personality disorder. So his super ego wouldn't really develop in the same way that ours would, somebody who doesn't have this diagnosis. I mean, in a sense, it still does because his adoptive father, Harry, was the one teaching him right from wrong, which I said earlier is one of the ways that the superego does develop. And even in the New Blood series of Dexter, we see him hallucinating his father after he had already passed away, as well as other people associated with this code. And normally, when they pop up, they're telling Dexter, be careful, follow the code, don't mess up, and making him feel guilty if he does anything outside of the code, which, like I just said, is what our superego would do if we do something that's against our own morals. Because the id and the superego are complete opposites, as you might imagine, they're at odds constantly. In Dexter, we see that his dark passenger side, which is the id, wants to sometimes just hurt people. But then his superego, which is that internalized code of Harry, steps in and say, "No, you have to follow the code. You have to make sure this person goes along with the code." It's like being in a really bad divorce, in the middle of a really bad divorce, right? And often those two sides, those two people are not going to see eye to eye. It's almost impossible. And so, what do you do in that instance to try to help with that? You get a mediator. And that is where the ego comes in. The superego is trying to control the id, but in a way that doesn't really make sense because it's just barking orders at it. It's just talking about you should do this because it's right, because it's moral. But what does the id care about morality? It just wants to do something, so it's going to do it. It doesn't care if it's right or wrong. So the ego mediates between the id and the real world. It tries to satisfy the desires of the id in a way that is realistic and, most importantly, a socially acceptable way. It develops in the first 6 months to 2 years of our life, which makes a lot of sense because pretty early on, we need to learn how to live in society, meaning we need to learn how to manage our id impulses. The ego is operating on the reality principle. And it truly does mediate between the id and the superego, the desire of these two. So, take for example, if you're at work and your boss was really, really making you angry, so you just want to cuss them out. That part would be the id, right? But the superego is saying to you, well, that would be insanely inappropriate to do. So instead, you decide to vent to a friend about it to get your emotions out that way. That's the ego mediating between those two to control your behaviors in a better way. The ego is also where our defense mechanisms comes out. Although its job is to be a mediator, if any of you have done that before, you understand how extremely stressful and taxing it is to be in between that tug of war. And you just want it to end as quickly as possible. And not just to end as quickly as possible because of things like stress or being uncomfortable, but because that level of anxiety for such a long period of time can impact your functioning. So the ego is trying to make sure that we aren't too emotionally overloaded, that we can keep functioning. And so that is where it might use some defense mechanisms. Going back to the example of wanting to yell at your boss at work, instead, I might bury that angry impulse deep, deep, deep down into my subconscious. That would be the defense mechanism of repression. Or instead of yelling at my boss, I instead take that anger out on somebody else and yell at, say, my spouse, who might be a safer person to turn that anger onto because they can't fire me, for instance. So now at this point, I'm using the defense mechanism of displacement. Or I might engage in rationalization and say that my boss wouldn't actually be rude to me for no reason. They're a really nice person. So something must have happened with them for this to be occurring. Or I can use the defense mechanism of sublimation. So instead, I might channel that anger into something else. So maybe I'll channel it into writing a really angry blog post if we were still in the 2011 Tumblr era. Or I might go to the gym and say, hit a punching bag instead. The ego is like our emotional shock absorbers. It'll do what it can to manage the id and the superego while also trying to manage our emotional capacities. But just like shock absorbers, it gets worn down after continual use. So the ego can really start to get worn down and not work as it should if the id and the superego are just too strong. And this is likely what happens in the case of most real life serial killers and Dexter, is that the id and or superego, if they're too strong, overwhelms the ego to where it's not really functioning anymore. And now you're just left with the id and superego just duking it out to see who will win. And so sometimes you might make the moral decision, sometimes you might just do what you want, but it's unpredictable which one is going to win out. Most real life serial killers have an incredibly strong id. But in Dexter's case, he has a pretty strong id and superego. But as we know, his morality is off. According to American society where he grew up, offing people is not okay. It's considered bad, it's considered against societal rules, but his dad steps in and teaches him that it's okay in certain instances. More instances than we actually would say it's okay in the US. Typically in the US, it's just in terms of self defense, where that would be accepted. So for Dexter, although it's kind of funny to say this, but a superego kind of developed correctly because he was acting based on what he was taught. He was taught that he should only off bad people, and so he did. But throughout the series, we see there's a couple times where he offed people that didn't fit this code, which are the moments when his id won out. To combine this with a very common factor that serial killers share, let's talk about the id, superego, and the ego when combined with childhood trauma. We can see how abusive parents, for instance, that are supposed to be teaching their kids morality, don't. And so when their superego forms, it's likely very, very weak. And because these kids grew up on violence, likely the id impulses that they're getting, that it keeps feeding them, are probably more violent in nature. And I mean, all of us, when our emotions are out of control, we have to regulate them in some way. And our parents, our guardians have a huge role to play in this. But for people who either don't feel emotions or their parents only cause them pain, they don't learn how to manage this internally. And if you don't learn how to manage your emotions internally, you're going to learn how to manage them externally. So when they're trying to then manage these impulses, these urges, they learn the only way to manage it is to satisfy it. And both the superego and the ego are probably too weak to do anything about it. The id's going to win every time. I really wanted to talk about this in depth because I see so many of us getting stuck in the trap of othering people, of saying that, oh, well, these folks are reserved for a special position that's termed evil. I mean, think about it. We often call these people monsters. There's even a Netflix show about the Menendez brothers, which is titled Monsters. And if someone's a monster, they're not human. And I could never be like them because I am human. And typically, the average person won't become a serial killer because there's so many things that have to come together to make that happen. But all of us have our own form of a dark passenger. And ignoring it won't make it go away. It'll just make it to where when it does come out, we're ill equipped to actually deal with it.
Harrison. Shut up! You don't really care about saving anybody, do you? You're just feeding this dark passenger. It's not even a passenger, it's driving. And you like it.